It probably take me a recap of what happened, what we discussed last week. So in the last session, we talked about how the Chinese Revolution overthrew the rule of feudalism and the bourgeoisie, how the dictatorship of the proletariat was established, and and how the Chinese people took to the road of constructing a socialist society. And at the amongst all this ongoing class struggle, the isolation from from the Chinese people were isolated from the outside world, and despite that, huge um, gains were made. I mean, China became self-sufficient when it was actually a starving nation before the revolution. Workers' cooperatives were set up, and collective farmings were set up. So adults were promised work for life, free health for the sick, um, care in retirement, and children were provided with free education. But after Mao, the capitalist orders regrouped, took over the means of production, and reverted the labor to being a commodity that could be hired and fired, bought and sold according to market forces. The dictatorship of the bourgeoisie was reestablished. State monopoly capitalism grew, which was very quickly supplemented by foreign monopoly capitalists through uh, uh, FDI, which is foreign direct investment, I think, which was pioneered by the World Bank and the International Monetary Funds and the World Trade Organizations. So that was where we left off last week. um, Profits from the public enterprises and the increasing foreign direct investment encouraged the state authorities to provide subsidies and incentives to exporters, and thus export-led economy grew in China. Uh, Shares in the global GDP was about 4.1% in 91, and that jumped up to 14% in 2010, making China the second largest economy in the world, presenting a very serious challenge to the US dominance in manufacturing. China's foreign debt was only 2.5% uh, uh, of the national income. Um, so they were never actually in any debt at all. Um, the other capitalist countries came to uh, rely on China for loans to finance their debts. China had never robbed any other nation, but by 2014, that was reversed by gripping other nations in the stranglehold of exploitative debts. This actually is the character of social imperialism, that you burden other nations with debt to such an extent that you actually are able to dictate how they run their lives. Mao said that we are in a phase of imperialism and working class revolution. Um, Lenin explained imperialism in to be a distinct phase in the development of capitalism, um, and which is taken from imperialism being the highest stage, imperialism being the highest stage of capitalism. So I mean, the nature of imperialism is that one, you have monopoly, uh, then you have parasitic. Uh, uh, that it becomes a parasitic on other nations, and the other thing is that it is actually moribund capitalism. That means it is actually the capitalism that exists actually becomes self-destructive. I think that's what it means. um, Imperialism has the following economic aspects, uh, that the general that monopoly actually becomes the victors, and the small bourgeoisie is taken over. Um, so there are five characteristics which Lenin says what imperialism has. And the document goes on to actually discuss each one of these characteristics in terms of in terms of the China model. Um, Regarding monopoly enterprise, China power in China is in the hands of bureaucratic monopoly capitalism and private monopoly capitalism. Foreign monopoly enterprises are controlled, though they bring in investments from external imperialist countries. The ruling class developed governments, the ruling class developed government and private monopoly and state-owned enterprises. Um, so and they functioned like ordinary multinational corporations and transnational corporations. The state and the Communist Party of China has more influence on these enterprises than you get in normal imperialist governments. In normal imperialist governments, there are certain checks and balances, but in China, the state and the Communist Party has very severe control on the monopolies. The managers of the China state monopolies and owners of private corporations are themselves members of the Communist Party of China. Three of the 10 largest corporations, super monopolies in the world, belong to China. American monopolies are fast losing ground to China. In other words, there are more monopoly capitalists growing in China than you get in the outside imperialist countries. Many exporting corporations in China run by foreign capital are being bankrupt and are being replaced by privately owned enterprises internal to China. Foreign direct investment is largely coming from Hong Kong, um, 456 billion US dollars in 2010, compared to only 78 billion dollars coming from the US. So it is a myth that most of the foreign direct investment comes from the US and Britain, Germany, etc. The number of Chinese millionaires was 2 million in 2013. This became 250, and there were 250 billionaires in 2013. And These are statistics which the point being that China is bringing out more millionaires and billionaires than the rest of the world. Most of China's super rich are private businessmen. China is the fourth wealthiest country in the world, behind US, Japan, and Germany. And yet its monopolies are more powerful with direct control in their businesses. So the monopolies inside China seem to be much more organized and able to direct the government and the nation than you get in the outside world. Exploitation and super exploitation are the motive forces of the Chinese imperialist system. They are organized, centralized, the fascistic and very bureaucratic state and enterprise. They mercilessly exploit their own working class, and they have the tendency to uh, uh, suppress any revolts. Uh, and there are revolts that take place inside China. We don't get to hear about them in the normal media, but there are revolts against the system. Large amounts of profits are extracted from the labor force after taking away their rights and benefits acquired through the socialist period. Labor has been turned into a commodity after creating an army of reserve laborers. Um, Reserve laborers because the communes were starved. Uh, so the peasantries uh, were became a reserve army of laborers, and they had to migrate uh, to the cities in order to seek jobs and feed themselves and their family. The document talks about the miserable nature of these migration labor into the cities. They lived in tunnels, they lived on the bridges, they lived in car boots, and so they were absolutely um, um, desperate, and they would take any job at any cost. So something like 200 to 300 million workers migrated from the countryside. The document makes a very controversial point in my view, and I quote the document. Um, and it says, uh, it says the policies of the socialist period under Mao Zedong, based on slogans including self-reliance, discipline, undeterred sacrifice, overcome pains or to serve the people and the country, played a major role in paving the way for the monopolies and the super exploitation of the working class. I don't understand that, what that actually means, but maybe we can talk about that. One wonders what alternative policies Mao could put forward in order for monopoly capitalism not to be returned or not to be realized. That I found quite uh, a marked point. Uh, to maintain its imperialist position, China must move its production to the backward countries, and it has started that process um, in the neighboring countries. Often in direct competition with the contending imperialist powers. And we will come on to how to maintain increased profits and increased um, uh, exploitation, that exploiting its own masses is not enough. They have to now engage in profiteering from the exploitation of the neighboring countries like Vietnam, Laos, and whatnot. And I think we will come to that in a bit. The the economic principles of imperialism is monopoly. And second is the formation of financial investments that is deployed into, that is developed into monopoly financial monopolies. They call it the oligopoly. Um, so along with the monopoly in industrial sectors, in develops monopoly in the banking sector. Major bank the sector invest in the shares in the industry, thus creating monopoly finance capital. Four of the top 10 world banks belong to China. These oligarchs are part of the central government within the leadership of the Communist Party of China, and they have complete control over this financial sector. Uh, they encourage bank loans to the state-owned enterprises, and these banks have a dual role to finance corporatization in the public sector and accumulate investment according to the direction of the government. The bureaucratic private monopoly capitalist class has entered the Communist Party of China and rotted the state from inside and have refashioned China in their own image. Um, According to the document, capitalist China has given rise to labor aristocrats. That's a new one on me. And petty bourgeoisie, numbering from 100 to 150 million. Labor aristocrats is a new thing for me. It suggests, firstly, that leadership of trade and farm unions were taken over by the revisionists during the capitalist restoration. Secondly, that bourgeois tendency amongst the factory management, service management, broker agents, lawyers, educators, and engineers formed the petty bourgeoisie because they received special attention. They received special recognition as professionals and managers from the foreign corporate investors. This is an interesting point which needs to be explored further, in my view. And in a way, you can imagine, if you're an engineer, you're a doctor, or you will be held in higher regard than the laborer. And this actually perhaps does give rise to the development of the middle class and the petty bourgeoisie. Anyway, let me just carry on. The global crisis of 1980 did not affect China to the extent it affected the Western imperialist world. The response to the crisis of the Western imperialist country was irrational investment in dot-com and companies like that. Um, Prime housing loans were, um, prime housing loans were given from 2000 to 2006 without any checks and balances, and which led to the subprime crisis in 2007. Japanese housing estate market collapsed in the 90s. The Chinese imperialists were not that far behind their counterpart imperialists in making irrational investments. China has also uh, has a huge housing crisis and has been there for many years. You will see if you, in China, huge, many towns, that have been developed so that they could be sold, but they just stand empty and are just ghost cities. So even China went through that phase of build and give loans, and, and many workers have bought second and third houses, or flats, and they're unable, their wages are unable to keep up with the payment. So you have got ghost cities growing all over China. um, There is no ideological difference between China and the capitalist imperialist countries. Their common factor is economic anarchy, which was avoided under centralized, people-oriented, planned economy. But you know, uh, that was under the socialist construction. But that centralized, people-oriented, planned economy does not exist anymore. Um, According to Lenin, imperialism is mainly defined by the rise of monopolies and capital exports. Export investments in the form of bonds and loans is what transforms capitalism to the stage of imperialism. Uh, the impact of extreme accumulation of wealth via industrial investments, financial investments, imperialist rents, and industrial productivity, coupled with massive bank investments, make capital export both possible and necessary. So when you got so much wealth, what do you do with it? You have to invest it somewhere. China is the largest capital creditor to America and Europe in forms of treasury bonds. In layman's terms, China is a moneylender who expects payment with interest. Moneylenders accumulate wealth, and the best easy way they can use their wealth is to and make more wealth is to lend the money on the promise of good interests and interest payments. Every worker peasant who has had to go to a moneylender knows what unscrupulous lot the moneylenders are, especially the private moneylenders. China is an active lender to many countries. It needs to be noted that China loans more to the backward countries than the World Bank does. Um, Excuse me, I have a cat who's bothering me. um,
It's a white or black.
it's a white cat, and anyway, he's probably gone now. um, I understand. Yeah, I see what you're saying. Uh, Whether the cat is black or white, as long as it catches the mice. Yes. uh, China began Go Global strategy in 2000. Chinese Prime Minister um, stated we must, this is in 2011, we must implement the Go Global policy in a more accelerated way. Policy must be approved. We must help companies and enterprises and people who can invest in other countries. This is the stated aim of the Chinese Prime Minister in 2011. The policy is designed to make multinationals based in China become global champions in the international market. Foreign technology is to be obtained through overseas foreign direct investment rather than FDI, which is foreign direct investment. So I guess overseas foreign direct investment is China investing outside rather than having investments coming into it. It is a basic necessity for all imperialist countries to find most profitable places in the world to exploit, and then to exploit them to the fullest possible extent. Um, that is the nature of imperialism. Um, the 2008 economic crisis led to insolvency of many firms and banks in the Western countries. Their governments bailed out multinational corporations with large stimulus packages. This opportunity was actually seized by the China to heavily invest huge capital in other countries. So the the companies that were on their last limb were actually uplifted by China investment. The scarcity of credits after the crisis was skillfully used by the Chinese capital. The Chinese OFDI, overseas foreign direct investment, was 2.5 billion US dollars, but in 2007 um, it grew to 18 billion, and it became 52 billion in matter of few years. So that was the at the same that was the the aggressiveness of their investment in the outside countries. Um, I'm perhaps going to take another 5 minutes, maybe, I hope. The role of the Chinese company is rapidly growing in semi-colonial and semi-feudal countries where they employ at least 80 million foreigners. So monopoly enterprises target investments in infrastructure projects such as the Gwadar harbor in Pakistan, nickel mines in Papua New Guinea. Chinese shipping giant has uh, uh, which is Costco, has 51% share in ports in Greece. It has huge investments in the supply of oil from Russia, Brazil, Venezuela, Kazakhstan. China created in China Investment Corporation to invest in external multinational corporations. It established uh, Asian Infrastructure Bank to gain foothold in Asia and Europe through its Belt Road initiatives. In China, in Asia, a rail link is designed to extend from Yunnan in China through Laos to Bangkok in Thailand, and then reach all the way to Rangoon in Myanmar. Myanmar, I'm not sure how this I say it. China wants Laos timber, rubber, minerals, and its minerals. China is setting up number of special economic zones in Laos, which will in turn, which will turn it into a virtual state of China, is what the document says. That you set up so many economic zones in Laos that they become totally dependent upon you. Like I think I explained last week, the special economic zones are enclaves within the country where the country does not exercise its own laws. Uh, you know, so when you set up these special economic zones, when China sets up these economic, they become actual China territory. China has invested $50 billion to create China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. This allows China to gain access to the Gulf and Africa, as well as provide strategic naval base in Gadar. China's officials who work on the project are provided with 15,000 soldiers for their defense. One can, you know, it has been unheard of that China has soldiers in external countries, but from this you can see what the plans are, I guess. The Gilgit-Baltistan route will pass through Kashmir, providing the People's Liberation Army access to the Indian Ocean. This will not only perturb India, but it will remove China's neutrality on Kashmir. Um, you know, no longer can China say, this is a Kashmiri people's issue. Pakistan was lured to providing military aid and nuclear technology, lured by providing military aid and nuclear technology. Pakistan's economy has stagnated and has become a field for exploitation for the Chinese enterprises. Cheap Chinese goods are destroying Pakistan's small manufacturers and handicraft producers. The small um, Pakistan's debt will have to be paid for by the people of Pakistan. Um, People from Balochistan and Sindh have been displaced through these road constructions and what have you, and they have not been given any compensation. So this Belt Road Initiative is creating displacements all over, not in Pakistan but all over. Wherever these projects are undertaken. So there is a growing movement against China inverted comma project. And NATO's withdrawal from Afghanistan will be replaced by China. China has increased economic, political, and security operations in Afghanistan. Copper mining, oil, and gas exploration are already started. China is now the largest foreign investor in Afghanistan. Afghanistan is being introduced into the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. We can talk about that, but this is their we can talk about that later. China is the largest financier and defense supplier in Sri Lanka. China is in a strategic, Sri Lanka is in a strategic place in the Indian Ocean, through which Chinese receives 90% of its imports. So China is developing infrastructure projects, including harbor facilities in Sri Lanka, which keeps India's dominance in check in the South Asia. China's policy of non-interference in the internal affair of other country lays exposed by its backyard support to the Sri Lankan government. Sri Lankan government's genocidal war against the Tamil people. Chinese project is in Sri Lanka is costing the people their land through forced displacement. America is ready to abandon Sri Lanka, and all efforts to hold the Sri Lankan government to account for war crimes against the Tamil people is now going to be a distant dream. I think I'm on the last page. Since the fall of the monarchy in Nepal, the souring of relations with India, China is using opportunity um, is using the opportunity to improve relations with Nepal. China aims to get Nepal to suppress the Tibetan refugees activists in Nepal and get their support to enhance security influence in South Asia. With announcements of huge aids, China plans to build business routes and hydropower projects in Nepal, improve their links, whilst at the same time trying to isolate Nepal from India, because Nepal is actually dependent on India for exporting and importing goods. So this will reduce Nepal's dependence on India. Chinese army is building close ties with the Nepalese army, which will increase the presence of the People's Liberation Army in the Himalayan region. Um, China has also targeted Africa to be under its influence, which has been largely ignored by other imperialist countries. Africa has enormous reserves of minerals such as oil, iron, copper, bauxites, and various other. China needs these raw materials from Africa. The Western imperialists are being replaced by the Chinese social imperialists. China is the single largest trader partner with Africa. It buys 1/3 of the oil from Africa, mainly Angola and Sudan. It is opening new fields in Sudan, and has built 900 miles of pipeline. Um, it is opening new facilities on the off coast of Nigeria. China is a strategic partner in oil and mining sectors in Congo. Um, it is engaging in mining projects in Zambia, building railways in Central Africa Republic and Uganda. Three Chinese-owned public oil companies um, operate in Africa. You know, in Africa, China implements socialism in words, but imperialism in action, says the document. Their socialist foreign policy of exploitation of the working class and the middle class is hidden behind the veiled chants of honesty, equality, mutual benefits, solidarity, joint development. Statements that always, these statements are always included in the mutual agreements in the African nation, with the African nations. And these sweet words are often used by the bureaucratic capitalist governments to sell the deals to the African people. Um, the African people are actually hungry for socialism. So this seems to be a way of quietening or you know quietening their demands that, yeah, we are dealing with a socialist country anyway, so what's the big problem. um the the chanted slogan of the Chinese proletariat during the period of socialist construction, be self-reliant, is not going to be allowed by the Chinese social imperialists. So that was the thing, that we must be self-reliant, but certainly they're not going to allow that to happen with other nations that they they want to dominate. China's foreign direct investment in Latin America is fast growing and has gone further than in Africa. China's banks loans in the Latin American have exceeded that of the World Bank. In in this part of the world, the Latin America, the imperialists and the social imperialists are competing to extract maximum exploitation from the people of Latin America. Um, there are hydroelectric projects being built in Argentina, in Ecuador, and China is investing in Chilean copper mines and Brazilian iron ore. That is all I want to cover in this session. I hope to conclude the review in the next session. I would say that I am by no means an expert on the subject. I am merely fulfilling the task of introducing the paper to you. Over to you, Tom.
Okay. Thank you, Blake, for presenting. I think you said you are going up to 26th page. I thought that is a general page. There are two types of 26 pages there.
Well, according to my PDF, I'm on page 26.
Yeah, okay, yeah, good. Yeah, you covered the international aspect also, how China is becoming an imperialist country. So let us start our discussion. You are saying,
I was going to say, Kalpana said this is too statistical. There's too many facts and figures, and it is very heavy reading. And I have tried not to use the statistics.
yeah, yeah. Paul, then Surinder, and then Kalpana. Paul. Paul has to unmute. Paul, you have to unmute. We cannot hear you. Ah, okay.
All right.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I have muted.
No, I think the hands went up simultaneously, so I'm happy to defer to
Yeah,
another colleague.
yeah.
Surinder looks ready to go, and Kalpana.
Okay, Surinder, Kalpana, and then Paul.
Okay, I think actually Paul might be able to address this more than. I just refer to the paper that Paul, I think you sent from that monthly review,
Yeah.
Hammond one, which sort of, contradicts what the paper that Lake is presenting.
Yeah.
And I can't remember all of it, but I think it said something about China is still on the sort of socialist course because it has a hybrid capitalist class, and that the state doesn't represent the capitalist class, and also that there isn't a working class. There isn't a proletariat class because the working classes or the workers still have access to sort of land and their basic means of subsistence. They're not totally propertyless. So it just goes against what this document has said. So I wondered, Paul, actually, if you could develop that in response to the paper that we've.
Yes, well, that's going to be also. I was going to raise a point linked to that. I think the paper I sent around, people may not have read it, but it's. I think it's worth reading because it gives, obviously, Leck's paper comes from a certain perspective, which is broadly anti-China in one sense, in terms of its interpretation of how China's evolved. Whereas the paper I sent around is written by an apologist for China, in the sense that they give an account of China which is much more positive. So I think it's perhaps worth, the paper I sent around, I think it's probably worth having a separate discussion on as a counterbalance.
Briefly.
But not now. But I mean, I think it merits a separate presentation.
Briefly.
But and I was going to raise this point, which is linked to that paper, which is that, well, very briefly, the paper I sent around makes the argument that it's wrong to use classic Marxist European language and concepts to understand what's happened in China. In other words, the author is criticizing the use of Eurocentric interpretation of history and a Marxist perspective, which is a Eurocentric perspective, to account for China. And if you take a different perspective, then you get a different insight into how China's history has evolved in terms of socialism and communism. So that's the starting point. So I think this merits a deeper discussion. Marxist notion of the Asiatic mode of production has been heavily criticised by non-Europeans as being a Eurocentric account of strange foreign countries. The point I was going to raise is it's not just for Lep to respond, it's for this discussion, is that is there a difference between Western state monopoly capitalism, where state monopoly, where monopoly controls the state. In other words, the state exists to support the accumulation of profit for monopoly capitalists. So that's the relationship. So state monopoly capitalism is where in the West, which is how Lenin described it, is where the state is captured by monopoly capitalists, and the state then, its purpose is to engineer the circumstances to enable them to accumulate profit as monopolies. And Britain's a classic case, and so is America, and so other places. So my question is in China, we have something called, broadly speaking, state monopoly capitalism, or other names for it, socialism with Chinese characteristics and so on. I would argue that there's a number of differences, which are important differences insofar as, for historical reasons, going back 1,000 years in China, state control of civil society, including the economic sphere, makes a very different set of arrangements. So although we have exploitation and we have millionaires and billionaires, and we have a private sector, the relationship of the private sector to the state is very different. And as I understand it, at least in theory, when China moved along its reformist approach, it made a decision post-Mayo. It made a decision to take a market approach to its problems, which meant private enterprise, but was very concerned about letting this beast to be unleashed. And so it can be argued that the history of state monopoly capitalism in China is the history of a relationship between the state and the Communist Party and private enterprise. And I think that relationship is a different one to what we have in the West, where the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese state heavily control the management of the private sector. Although profits made for individuals, and there's vast amounts of corruption, I think there's a different dynamic being played out, which makes for a very different kind of analysis. So I'll stop there, but I think this important point for debate is state monopoly capitalism in China different to the Western version, and what are those differences? And is this due to Chinese own history and the role of the Communist Party in China? Does that begin to answer your question, Surinder? You're mute. Can't hear you. Unmute.
Is that
Yeah.
unmute now?
Yeah.
Can you hear me? Okay, sorry, there was also the point that the working class wasn't totally propertyless, that they still had land and therefore wasn't a proletariat in the traditional sense.
This relates to Chinese social relations and the way workers in China, as it were, orchestrated. So people come from villages and they retain that village connection in terms of administration, in terms of benefits, in terms of facilities. So you may be what's called an internal migrant. You go to the city to work from your village, but if you lose your job, and it's what happens in the 2008 crisis, then millions of Chinese workers were laid off because of a downturn. But they could return to their villages where they were registered and receive benefits from the state via their village connection. So that's a very important distinction to be made, is that are we talking about a true proletariat, which is landless, and all they have is their labour, as in the West, or in China, the retention of links with the village system and the administration of people as kind of internal management of internal migration. People can return to villages where they have community and other links. They can access benefits from the village, unemployment benefits, for example, albeit not very much, but at least they have some sort of fallback situation in times of crisis, which is a big difference to the historic proletariat of the West. It's another example of the difference between the Chinese path and the Western path, which begins to challenge Marxist concept of the proletariat being a landless, alienated group of people who have left the land behind. Many Chinese workers still have land connections through their kinship systems. It's an extra resource they have.
Yes, I thought, although that paper made those points and makes you think that, you know, maybe China isn't sort of the same imperialist sort of nature as the West, in a way, the inequalities that have resulted since China took that path are much, much greater now than when they started. So it really doesn't matter how these social relations are different, but what matters is the reality and the gap that's growing between the rich and the poor, isn't it?
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, that particular article is interesting and suggests, and it has been on PBS, the American Public Broadcast Institution, Public Broadcast Service, PBS. It's worth watching on Freeview. Has just completed the history of China. It's been repeated several times in the past couple of years. It's a 6-part series on the history of China, and it describes, for example, up to the 1800s, up to 1830, China was the biggest economy in the world. It's far bigger in terms of world wealth. It's the biggest economy in the world, dwarfing European economies. We forget how important the big China was until its decay in the 19th century. This series suggests also, and the article I sent round suggests, that capitalism in various forms emerged in China by the 10th century. There are vast networks of trade and commerce, there are factories, there are wage workers in China, well in advance of what happened in Europe. Surprise, surprise. which of course Marx was unaware of in his analysis. I mean, it wasn't quite the same, but the emergence of a mercantile class and vast trading networks emerged in China far, far earlier than elsewhere. That's kind of a hidden history, just as the history of Africa has been obliterated by the West and by white supremacy. The true history of China has also been obliterated through Western perspective. So it's very important to locate historically Chinese evolution.
Okay. Put my hand up.
Yes, Lake wanted.
It's an interesting point Surinder is making.
No, you just
In terms of, what is the definition of proletariat? I have a land, I have a house. Am I a proletariat or am I the bourgeoisie? So if you translate that into China, are we going to call them not proletariat? It has always bugged me. That question has always bugged me. I used to run a corner shop, a grocery store, an off license. Was I a capitalist or was I a working people person? So I think the definition has to be, do I employ somebody and use that somebody's labor to profit from? That is the definition, in my view. The definition isn't because, my father has left me some land, which I then divide with my sons and daughters or whatever. So the definition is of proletariat is, do you depend on somebody else's labor to profit? So basically that's the point I wanted to make. And I think the nature of the Chinese society now is a very much monopoly capitalist, designed to make rich get richer and designed to make poor get poorer, because you don't give them their labor value. That's the nature. And I don't think there is any difference between the external Western imperialist nations and the Chinese, you can call it social imperialism. I don't think there is any nature. Capitalism is capitalism. It is actually designed to rob people of their labor value. Thank you.
Kalpana, did you want to say something?
Yeah. Yeah, you can unmute. Philippa, you can unmute. Philippa wanted to ask something.
Yeah, thanks. Hi. Thank you. It's interesting. Lex just done a kind of a summary of what I was going to say. Okay, so from a personal point of view, and I don't know enough about the education system in China, the health system, support systems. I think you have to pay for them. They're commodities and you buy them. That's my understanding.
True.
And I don't know where the unions stand, the rump unions and things like that. But Paul just said not true, so he'll tell us about that. I really think that the education system is probably, I don't know, even similar to India, perhaps. Would you say there's a universal free education system in India?
Absolutely not.
a universal health system in India?
Absolutely not.
But there are rump systems, aren't there?
Sorry?
There are rump. There are basic systems in place.
On paper, there's both education and health is provided by state governments up to a certain level. Whether you use it or whether it's appropriate is besides the point, but it is available.
Right. Exactly. I think China is probably like that, but I've got to find out much more. One of the issues I find, two issues. One is that I find that people tend to be apologetic and talk about China as socialism with Chinese characteristics because they are really concerned about the Western onslaught against China and an impending war even that might be happening and how we're all being buttered up to make China an enemy. So in defense of China, well, against Western imperialism and Western aggression, people find themselves defending China in various ways. So, well, that's my major concern at the moment. My second concern is that, are we trying to say that change is still possible in China? This is what I don't know whether Lek's paper is going to come and talk about, or whether the paper you're talking about said that the path to socialism collapsed when there was a bourgeois revolution after Mao, revisionists took control, and that it seems to be the most extreme form of capitalism and the state monopoly capitalism at the moment. Is there any change? Is there any change that could be foreseen? That's what I'd like to know.
That's very interesting question, and I think if you go by what Lenin says, you know, imperialism is the highest stage of capitalism, and after that, what do you get after imperialism? And I think Lenin, you know, more learned people will tell me better. But what Lenin is suggesting, that after imperialism, there is nothing. The only thing you can look for is working class uprising or the destruction of the world. That to me is the conclusion which Lenin came up with, that after imperialism there is nothing. You know, we've gone through all the stages of primitive society, feudalism, slavery, and everything. That imperialism is the highest stage of capitalism, and either the working people of the world will have to unite. You know, not the working people of individual nations, but the working people of the world will have to unite. And I think I do see that happening as well, because, you know, I would never have imagined even 10 years ago that you know, the farmers in India would cotton on to the fact that, you know, we're not fighting Modi. We are fighting imperialist. We are fighting corporatization. We are fighting that. You know, and every peasantry worker peasants and workers in India are cottoning on to that fact, and they're not only just cottoning on to the fact that, you know, they're cottoning on to the fact that, you know, the industrialists and the monopoly capitalists are destroying our land. You know, we are not getting the same product from the land soil we used to get. You know, and so there is there is an international connection with all this. You know, the environmentalists in Latin America, the environmentalists in Asia are uniting and joining hands. So there is that hope, and if that hope does not materialize, then I think Lenin says the world will just self-destruct.
Okay,
It's
Philippa
my
wanted
interpretation of
Yeah.
Lenin.
Just very quickly to come back on that, exactly, like just from what you've just said, I've heard it said, take some studying to understand it, that the climate change and the environmental issues, I've heard it said, are the second contradiction in capitalism.
Yeah.
That's what I've heard it said by some environmentalists. I've still got to quite understand it, but that's something that they've said, that it's the environmental crisis that's going to somehow disrupt, put a brake on capitalism.
Absolutely, because the monopoly capitalists do not care about environment. All they care about is profit making. You know, that is their nature, that is their gene. And the people who care about it are people who live, you know, the Adivasis, the people the tribal people who live in the jungles, you know, they care about their land, you know. So there is that major contradiction. I believe. And eventually people, I think, will win.
Yeah, Paul.
Yeah, sorry, just to very briefly clarify some.
What I said.
No, some things about Chinese welfare system as it currently is. For example, education between the ages of 6 and 15 is free.
Same in India.
It's provided by the state. It's administered regionally and locally, and the quality varies from, especially between town and city. But there's free education between the ages of 6 and 15. Afterwards, of course, then what's called higher education, which includes higher secondary education, is not free, but nor is university education. But there are grants and scholarships for impoverished people. In terms, so that's just a brief concept idea of education. In terms of health, there is, broadly speaking, what's called a social insurance system. If you work in all employees can access health facilities through insurance, which is jointly provided by themselves and their employer. So people who work in factories and other companies can access health services. They contribute through their wages, and the employer also contributes, as we do in Britain.
Okay.
If you're unemployed, if you're a student, there are different arrangements for health, and the quality varies enormously between city and rural parts of China, different regions. And of course, China introduced the notion of the barefoot doctor, who went around the countryside providing healthcare.
Years ago.
So healthcare is not free in China. It's an insurance-based system, but quality varies, and very often you have to pay for prescriptions, that sort of thing. It's not so dissimilar to the British system in many ways.
Okay.
In terms of
Education you've done.
benefits, there is an unemployment benefit system. It's not very generous. It's means tested, and it's organised through municipalities and local governments, and access is variable because there's so much stigma attached to claiming it. But there's a basic welfare system, hardly what you'd call top-notch socialist, but compared to many countries, it's quite sophisticated. So that's kind of the general background to the welfare system in China. increasingly people have to pay for books for their children at schools and that sort of thing. And the quality of operations and that sort of thing in the health service is quite varied. The trouble is China's a vast, vast country, 1.4 billion people. There are vast disparities between regions in China, between the countryside and cities, between towns and cities. And depending where you live, it's kind of like a postal code lottery. But that's no different to other places, including Britain. So in a world context, the Chinese welfare and benefit system stands up, I think, quite well to many other countries. It is far from socialism, but we're looking at where China's come from. You either say, is it half full or is it half empty? You can make your own judgments on that.
You wanted to say something? Your hand keeps going up and down.
Yeah.
Ooh,
Kalpana.
Yours.
okay. Thanks, Tom.
You said about the tail.
Lex, thank you for making that quite a heavy document sort of clear. I'm not against statistics. It just I find it quite difficult to incorporate it and sort of find it. But I mean, that particular document shows the sort of exponential rise of in the direction of imperialism, and quite effectively, and particularly into finance capital. I thought. I think we started discussing that end of last week's meeting, but Chinese government used to talk about Soviet Union as the imperialist, social imperialist and imperialist in deeds, etc. And now it seems as if they seem to follow the same model. I mean, it is quite obvious that their sort of colonization, particularly in Africa, they actually got land as well as investment in various infrastructure projects. So they're actually buying land to produce food that will supply them, so they become self-reliant, but by using and exploiting other countries, etc. So there's a lot of examples of that various African organizations have highlighted, and I think that's going similar way in Latin America as well. So, but I mean, in a way, they built on the past history of three worlds and their unity with the third world countries. So they have used the socialist links or ideas and actions in that period to develop the new relationships. And I think, when you said you were a bit surprised about in the document about serve the people, etc., that phrase that you used, in a way, it's people when they were going through difficult conditions or were being exploited and things, a lot of people would go along with it, justifying to themselves and by their officials that we're doing this for the greater good, the socialist enterprise, if you like. And so in a way, by using people's good intentions and good ideology and good sort of the understanding of socialist revolution, but that's been now used to stop the fight back, etc., stop the criticisms, to serve the new enterprise of capitalism and capitalism enterprises. That's the way I understood that phrase, and I do understand it, because otherwise there would have been a lot more resistance to that. The third thing I wanted to sort of develop, those sort of contradictions have existed even under post-revolution, under the sort of the socialist phase, if you like, regards what SAFE brought last time, the oppression of national minorities and the other nations by the dominant nation. And Tibet is one example, but there are the other internal colonies, if you like. And there's always that contradiction about those sort of so-called defined as feudal internal countries, or less developed compared to the main Chinese area. if you start importing so-called progress by importing capitalism or education, you are actually changing those colonies anyway. Now that could be seen from both, as our definition, we earlier talked about feudalism, capitalism, monopoly capitalism as a progress. That's going along a particular revolution, but it's not self-determination. And one of the phrases under the previous, if you like, Communist Party of China was self-determination. And those various national minority regions weren't given that, if you like. So that's where the sort of the imperialists, we know better and we're going to control what happens. That sort of ideology is coming in. And in relation to other imperialism, I mean, as well as commerce and finance, my two things would be, in the past, there's obviously competition between the US and China looming up. And in the past, that's when the competition becomes intense, that gets resolved by military means. And China is definitely developing naval power. And there's all these constant things going on in Pacific, as well as more investment in the military, military equipment and things. So that should be sort of looked at more closely. And last thing was, even if it's last thing I wanted to say was that I really enjoyed that article Paul sent around, because up till then I hadn't really seen the sort of Mao's analysis in the context of its history, because Mao has done the analysis of Chinese society in the early 20th century, but that particular article does go back 1,000 years, and so that was quite a good way of looking at it, and perhaps other people should read it and we can discuss that in detail. So that's it. Thank you.
Okay, it is 8:45 now.
Sorry, talk too much.
8:25. Shall we wind up?
I just want to say that
Yes, Lake.
I want to apologize that I did not read the article Paul sent around, because I was heavily burdened with the document I had. So I have to apologize. So a lot of people are commenting on it, and I can't fully engaged. But I think the essence of this document we are reading is to make a categorical statement that what is the character of China today. If we are going to keep on calling it a socialist China, then we have to treat it very differently. And then we will fall under the axe of, look what they're doing to their people, look what they're doing in Africa, look what they're doing in Sri Lanka, look what they're doing here, there, and everywhere. So I think, as I'm now speaking on sort of from the perspective of the Communist Party of India Maoist, although I have no authority in that sense. But I mean, this is what the document is trying to say to you. So, if we don't criticize it, if we don't recognize it for what it is, then how on earth are we going to advance our socialist revolution throughout the world? then if we are going to continue to say that China is a socialist nation, then where the hell does Marxism, Leninism, Maoism go? How do we defend it? And I think the Communist Party of India Maoists have taken a very bold step and said, this is what we believe. This is not the socialism we want. And this is absolute failure of socialism has not been, as I used the word last week, I think, socialism hasn't failed. Socialism has been defeated. So this goal, which is very synonym, which is very, because at the end of the day we are fighting a class war, and in wars you are going to have defeats and retreats and things like that, and China has been defeated, and the war goes on.
Yeah. Okay, shall we wind up? Okay, next week, Lake, you are continuing next week?